Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Orton with the Los Alamos League of Women Voters. Welcome to our February lunch with a leader. This month we have Hari to speak with us, and I've asked him to give a brief bio because although I sat with his mom on the Nature Center board for a decade, I know less about Hari's biography. So thank you very much, Hari.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, so I actually moved here to Los Alamos, I think right around 1977. And so I came here when I was in second grade. And so my father was a physicist at LANL, and both my parents still live on Los Pueblos, actually. And yeah, they're getting up there in age, but they're still hanging in there and doing pretty well. And so I went through the high school system here. Actually, Becky was my AP English teacher. It's still one of the hardest classes I had, right? And so actually, I guess a funny story was, I believe she had the Cliff Notes for all the different, books that we had to read, right? And so a lot of these, like Shakespeare and things like that, and a lot of us would have the Cliff Notes and sort of try to, see if we can get away with reading the summary of the Cliff Notes. But she had the Cliff Notes, so she would ask tests and things like that went around the Cliff Notes. And so then, all of a sudden, like at the end of the Cliff Notes, they have a few example essays, right? And she would never give us those ones because she had the Cliff Notes, and then once she actually gave us the exact, I don't know if you remember this, you gave us the exact essay question that was at the back of the Cliff Notes, and a bunch of us stupid high school kids were just like, yes, finally! Like the investment in the Cliff Notes really paid off, and so we all I think I just blatantly copied the Cliff Note essay, and then it came back with a 0, and like, come see me after class. And then it was sort of like, you can redo this, but if you do this in college, they're just going to throw you out. And so that was definitely a memory that stuck with me. And actually, it's fairly relevant to this because I'd like to see what Becky does today with ChatGPT, because it's extremely difficult to, and I'll sort of go into that. Like, you can get ChatGPT to write unbelievably good essays, and if it looks, too formal and too ChatGPT-ish, you can give it a prompt and basically tell it to change it up, make it look more casual. You can put in a few things here and there, and I think it would take a Becky-level person to figure out if it was ChatGPT or not. And so, yeah, and so then I went off to undergraduate in Santa Barbara, California, chemical engineering. I got my PhD in Urbana-Champaign in environmental engineering as a visiting professor in Europe, and then I came back here to be a staff member around 2001, working with Earth and Environmental Sciences Division. And so actually, Becky's husband, Tom, was one of my heroes because he was one of the first fellows that came out of that division, and a couple of years ago I became a fellow, so that was kind of a big deal for me. And so, yeah, I think what I was asked to do is give a non-technical introduction to artificial intelligence, which is kind of permeating all sorts of facets of our life, like all over the place. There's actually, lots of fear, and rightly so, but there's also some really impressive things that it can do. And the other thing to point out when I go through this, non-technical, it's very hard to get around some of the jargon that's just there with respect to some of the things in AI, but we can, this can be pretty casual. You can even raise a hand and just say, what the heck do you mean by that term? Because what I want you to take away from this is it's actually pretty basic stuff on what it actually does, and it's not that complicated, and it's actually really important for people to know what it can do, what it can't do, and with most technological advances, you can use it for really good stuff or really bad stuff, and it's always easier to use it for bad stuff because it's just easier to do bad things. And so, yeah, but that's not to say, and so if we go through, my outline, I'll kind of, and so part of this is actually, what jobs can AI actually just really help you with and, take over? and what are things that's really pretty far away from doing. So I just said, okay, I might as well. I don't have a talk like this, and I don't have the figure, so I just told AI to generate all the figures for this talk, And like you'll see, some of them are decent, but I didn't try really hard either. Like you can actually make really good figures with AI. You can put in, and maybe people have messed around with this. Definitely, like my son, who's in high school, does this kind of stuff all the time, because you can just type in a prompt and say, for example, they have a high school project at Peak. They're trying to figure out how to prevent mountain lions from getting killed at the stables. So they have a critter cam that takes a picture, and then they have machine learning figure out if it's a mountain lion, and if it is, it sets off alarms. So you can tell ChatGPT, where the AI image part of it's called DALL-E, you can just say, give me an image of a mountain lion walking by a stables at night, and show me a picture of a critter cam taking the image, show me a speaker, show me a critter cam, and it gets you 90% of the way there. And then you can bring it into Photoshop. And so at work, we would give it to a graphical designer in the past, and spend like $10,000 to come up with the figure, and it'll take weeks. You can do that in like 10 minutes. And so I'll give kind of examples like that. So what is AI? Loosely speaking, it's touching all the different stuff in that. And then I thought it was actually pretty interesting to go through this and see how quickly things really have been advancing, and how for the longest time nothing was advancing. Because if we'll get into this, but Nobel Prize in Physics and Chemistry are AI contributions this year. But like the actual neural network idea, like it was late 50s, early 60s, and we went decades where nothing much was happening. And then certain things happened that really set it off on this thing. And then there's another part of this, which I found really fascinating, is that AI will get into this. It's a data-driven approach, and I'll explain what that is later. And Los Alamos tends to be a place founded by physicists, and we believe in physics-informed approaches, which means equations. But actually, throughout human history, we've had data-driven approaches and physics-informed approaches, and so AI is just sort of the latest in this kind of evolution. So it's not that different in that sense. It's just what it can do is obviously it's the newest technological breakthrough. And then we'll sort of get into, I don't know if any of you have read the books by Harari, like Sapiens and things like that, but he has a book which is called Nexus, and it basically defines, most of humanity has relied on information networks, like chimpanzees, which are probably the second most advanced to us. They can communicate with like the maximum of about 100, individuals, and that's sort of pushing it. And actually humans, if we didn't have information networks, would also be limited to about 100. And so sort of explains AI has a huge role to play in this information network for good and bad. I'll go into the risks, and then also what we're doing at Los Alamos with AI to sort of give you an idea. And so, at the most broad definition of AI is it's just a computer science, and the idea is to just simulate human intelligence. And actually, even when I was an elementary school student, they were sort of predicting it was like right around the corner, even when I was in elementary school, and it was like not at all around the corner. It's kind of like fusion, like where it's always like 50 years off or something like that, and it just seemed like, okay, I guess getting to any sort of human level intelligence is just really hard to do, right? And then this image, this is what, if you get something out of this talk, what is it AI really doing? It basically needs a bunch of data, and it uses this data to basically figure out patterns and trends. And the thing is, that's kind of what we mostly do too. Even a little, you watch your toddler grow and you sort of see how they're figuring things out and everything. I mean, the most fascinating part of like the top-notch AI conference that I went to this last December, I went for my own work, but I also got to go because the Peak kids won, and so they actually are trying to figure out how to much better train AI more like you would train a human being. Like, just slowly, systematically, not just make it this brute brute force data thing. And the reason I have data and I have this dollar sign there, if you sort of look at the richest people in the world right now, which has huge political implications as you see how things are going in Washington, a lot of them, Elon Musk is one of the OpenAI founders, along with Sam Altman, Zuckerberg. I mean, if you look at all the tech billionaires, when I was in Urbana-Champaign, they showed me the first internet browser, and it was Netscape. And people would show me, like, this shows you how clueless I am. This is going to be such a breakthrough. Look, you can look at CNN on here, and you can buy a few things on here. And I was just like, why would I want to do that? And it turned out that was a very big deal. And then when Google came out and you could search for stuff, I remember thinking, this is amazing because it's free. And how are they going to, they're just going to go broke. Like Facebook, it's just free. Like, they're just going to go broke. But they're the richest people on the planet right now. So why? Because they've been collecting everyone's data, and data is the money in today's world. I mean, basically if you look at who are the richest people in the world, for the most part, used to be oil and gas and all that sort of stuff, but they've mostly been taken over by people who collect data. And I'll explain why everybody wants to collect data. It's because you can figure out a lot of trends and a lot of patterns from that. These are the main categories of AI, and don't get hung up. One thing that my mom always annoys me with, because she's super smart, is she'll just look at something like that and say, too much for my brain, and just shut off her brain. Don't shut off your brain, because it's just like a jargony word, but there's really not that much to it. So machine learning is mostly what AI and machine learning are often used interchangeably, but these are just algorithms that look for patterns and trends in a bunch of data. Natural language processing is what ChatGPT is. And so what they basically did is they trained on a crazy amount of text, because imagine the internet has so much text that you could just train these models, and people actually, like in academia and so on, we're sort of poo-pooing the idea of just brute forcing and training on all the data that's out on the internet. Like, what's that really going to give you? But you got to a certain, let's say you had a 1 million parameter model, and it was just really dumb and useless. All of a sudden they got to 1 billion parameter models, and then all of a sudden the models started showing crazy smart behavior. And so that started getting kind of interesting, because it was able, and no one could even explain why it was getting. And so to give you an idea, ChatGPT is about a 3 trillion parameter model, and how much they've trained on, they're actually getting worried that they're running out of the internet to train on. I mean, that's basically, you could even see, not siding politically one way or the other, but, what is Doge doing? They're actually trying to get a hold of a bunch of different data and also train it on AI algorithms. It's data, data, data. Everything's data. Computer vision, this is actually something where a lot of good can come and a lot of bad, because you can basically identify all of our faces. I don't know if you've come in on an international flight lately. I mean, you just kind of walk through. It just does your image identification, checks to see if it's on your passport, and it right away just nails it, and it just sends you through, right? I mean, the kind of things you can do with computer vision for medical imaging, you can find things in things that doctors would look at that the doctor wouldn't even see, that the AI is able to find, and then a doctor is able to use that information. So a lot of good things can come, but you could also imagine how you could use it for surveillance and all sorts of stuff. The whole self-driving car thing is actually pretty fascinating. They're not out, if you notice. We don't have self-driving cars for the most part, and the reason is AI is often good at getting about, I don't know, I'd say 90 to 95% of the stuff right. But if you mess up on the 5%, and you're, and I don't want to, I'll explain, but I think very quickly, for example, AI is trained on a bunch of images. And so it basically says, oh, human being, that's a human being, that's a human being, that's a human being, don't run over the human being. But then the human being's carrying a sign or something like that. And actually, it's pretty fascinating. Even the dumbest human being will be that's a human with a sign. right? Like, yeah, I mean, and I'm not even, let's not even say dumb. Like, even like a 3-year-old would say that, right? But the AI is sort of like an alien intelligence. It could look at that and basically be like, that's not a human being. And so that was one of the big deal cases where it just plowed over someone carrying a sign. Then obviously you can train it to be like, don't hit train it with an image with a human with a sign, but what if it's not a sign and now I'm carrying a tennis racket or something and it plows me over, right? So it's not the same type of understanding, but that is improving too. It's improving extremely quickly. They're getting to be a lot smarter. And then experts in robotics, by the way, they've almost got it to the point where you can enter a prompt like, hey, go get me my apple out of the refrigerator, and the robot will just go do it, right? But again, you start feeling pretty good about being a human because we can actually do a lot of stuff like get apples out of the fridge, which is actually like a really hard thing. It's non-trivial to train a robot to do that. And then finally, for medical diagnosis, fraud detection, and all that kind of stuff, it's extremely good because it's able to just look at, one, there's so much fraud that you can train to a lot of fraud and you can catch all sorts of stuff. Unfortunately, there's a lot of disease. You can catch a lot of that too. And so, this is, I think, really fascinating. Like, why is this all happening so quickly right now? Because this perceptron, which is, again, a jargony type thing, and then you probably have heard the word neural network. Just think of a neural network as, if you think of a construct that we have a bunch of brain cells that are all communicating with one another, and that we have more neurons than a chimpanzee that has more neurons than a bird that has more neurons than amoeba, right? Clearly more neurons seem to make a difference, hopefully, although sometimes it's hard to tell. That's true. But since all of us have the same number of neurons and behave quite differently. But I guess this idea of the perceptron and coming up with the neural net was viewed as, oh, this is really going to take off. And it just did not take off. And so when I went to this NeurIPS conference, they sort of went through the history of artificial intelligence. And they went like decades where this conference this year had like 15,000 people. Like my kid's award got announced in front of like 7,000 people, right? Like Nobel laureate people and all that stuff. But like it was down to like 100 people before. And like it was just kind of like going nowhere. And the question is, why has it all of a sudden taken off? Actually, the innovation was the 1958 thing. That was the biggest innovation. But you couldn't take advantage of the innovation without, one, the computing power. The computing power, Los Alamos, when I grew up here, and even still, we often have one of the 10 fastest computers in the world, or 5 fastest and all that, right? And we could do the kind of simulations no one else could come close to doing. And then video games came, and it became like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And before, companies like Cray and everybody would develop their computers for us. But now they were just developing it for like the video game people. And so NVIDIA, so actually the NVIDIA CEO was here, I don't know, in the last 6 months, Jensen Huang. I mean, that's probably a top 3 company. I got to talk to him about the work we do and everything. And his big innovation, a computer has what's called a CPU. That's the brain, the central processing unit. GPU is graphical processing unit. What Jensen Huang figured out is for video games, something like 95 to 98% of the calculations are not at all fit for CPUs. They're really inefficient on CPUs. So if you want to have much better video games, you need a different type of chip. So he made the GPU, and he founded this company, NVIDIA, and then everybody went and did this video game stuff. Then the AI people said, oh, I wonder if GPUs will do any better on our AI stuff than the CPUs, and it turned out like GPUs do really well on training AI algorithms. And so that is the first ingredient. The next thing is we'll get into this, but when you look at images, I was trying to look up the actual statistics, but once you get to like some 5-year-old or something, they can just identify like millions of images, like a 5-year-old. And the computers, even if you go back about 15 years, are like, can't even do like 1,000 or something, right? And so it just shows but then the internet showed up with like a crazy number of images and a crazy amount of text, and you could just start training with the big computer power and the big data, and people just sort of said, I wonder what'll happen if we do that. And then the final thing, which gets a little bit more technical, but neural networks, think of it as a bunch of neurons connected together. You can either go across, which is shallow, or you can go deep. So you probably hear the word deep learning, at least it's like a good jargony thing to do. It turned out going deep makes a huge difference. So when you combine deep learning, big data, and computer power, it turned out to just explode into like crazy innovation and goodness and badness and everything in between. But let's kind of walk through some of this, because I found this pretty fun to put this talk together, because I didn't know that I knew the details, but I never had to put it together in a logical manner. But I still remember when Kasparov like stormed off like in a huge tantrum, like when he lost to the computer. But chess was something that was predicted that humans are going to lose, because you can just calculate and brute force enough steps ahead of time. You can do the opening and the closing maneuvers that you do, and you can memorize all that sort of stuff. So even if a computer beat the grandmaster, people mostly didn't give the computer much credit. It's just sort of like, well, you just memorized everything. You're not actually that smart, right? And so, but why was this thing such a big deal? First, it hadn't happened. You couldn't beat the grandmaster, and it sort of showed that you could at least do it in a brute force manner. And then it also, but what became way more interesting is that since then, there are AI models that do not brute force it at all. They just literally go by, they just basically use rules and a lot more reasoning and thinking. And there's no grandmaster that can come even close, which is why you have all these cheating scandals of like, you know, Grandmaster A like had snuck in a computer and went to the bathroom and was trying to figure out what move to make next. And, you know, pretty much now, like you take a cell phone, you know, chess program, and it's going to beat the grandmaster, and it's not even that computationally a powerful algorithm, you know. So yes, it may have started out in '97 as being a pretty brute forcey thing, but things like Alpha Zero, the reason it's called Zero is because it's not memorizing a ton of stuff. It's actually just going by the way we would go about it. This one is huge. So this is the image classification breakthrough, and it sort of gets to the point of, there's a professor that when I went to this NeurIPS conference in December, there were something like 200 people lining up to get autographs with her. Okay, and so they're like Say, and so she's a Stanford professor, and what she did is she recognized the whole thing, that like the best benchmarks for image classification had only like 1,000 images, but then she had little kids, and she's like, but my little kid like knows, like, you know, she actually counted, like, my little kid can do like millions of images, and we're trying to get the computer to do like 1,000, but no one had like a benchmark that said, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a horse, you know, and all. But and like in academia, it's really not that easy to get your funding, your proposal funded by saying, I'm going to go through millions of images and label them dog, cat, horse, right? Because it's just sort of like, you're at Stanford and you're going to do that, right? But basically she did do that, though. And she came up with like millions and millions of images. And so 14 million images, which was the ImageNet challenge, in a bunch of 1,000 different categories. And when they ran this challenge, there was zero hope that anyone would come close to being able to do it at all. Right? And so Hinton, one of the Nobel Prize winning guys, as well as Ilya, who's the guy who's in the news for kicking out Sam Altman for OpenAI because Altman took the guardrails off of all the security stuff for OpenAI. Those were the guys that did a convolutional neural net. Don't worry about what that means, but it's just an algorithm that cracked this ImageNet challenge like by leaps and bounds. Like they just blew away everybody else, and it pretty much like could do the 14 million images. Like, and so all of a sudden, this thing is able to look at photos and pretty much tell what something is. That opens the door just to like a ton of stuff, right? Because basically you can now classify with human-like accuracy all of a sudden. You're basically, for medical imaging, self-driving cars, which still have problems because of it's so catastrophic when you mess up. Although in reality, they're still way better than most human drivers because human drivers are so bad. I mean, at least it's not texting or drinking, you know. But still, if an AI car hits something, it's going to shut down the entire business. If a drunk driver hits something, it depends on what state you're in and all that. But I think this one was huge. Okay, so this one is one of the most fascinating ones to me. People would say computers are going to beat humans in chess. You know, you can just memorize, you can do it. But Go is a game, I don't know, let's make it interactive. How many of you in the audience even know what Go is? That's pretty good. Okay, so hopefully I'm not just saying a bunch of stuff you already know. Am I saying stuff? Because I can. Okay. So Go, I didn't know this myself, but in Asia, it's like the big strategy game, and so there are schools where you go and learn Go. And so, like, if I went to school A, I would play a certain strategy, and if I go to school B, I would play a different strategy. And the reason Go is such a big deal is that there are more possible board states than atoms in the universe, meaning that the number of possibilities, you can't memorize it. You basically need to have intuition. You need to know what the heck's going on to be able to win at Go. So people really thought there's no way in hell a computer anytime soon is going to be able to beat humans at Go. And so what ended up happening? People started doing these things called reinforcement learning, which basically means that you come up with you have one model that's trying to win at Go, and then you have another one that's attacking it and basically trying to find all its weakness, and they're just going back and forth. And remember, they're fast and they don't have to sleep or anything. They can just keep doing this thing forever. And so, you know, it basically self-learned through millions of simulated games. It's not even looking at like the real games, you know, the human games. It's just doing simulated games. And so what was really fascinating about this is that, you know, the world champion at Go played against the computer, and there's commentators for this stuff where they're just sort of like, oh, that was a good move, that was a good move. Then the computer made a move that apparently just seemed like an unbelievably stupid move. Right, and they were all laughing, saying like, "Oh, you know, there you go again. You know, the car ran over the guy with the sign. Like, here goes the AlphaGo doing something really stupid." That turned out to be the move that totally defeated the world champion. And so what happened is, because there's so many board states and there are schools of Go, there's a whole unexplored parameter space of Go that humans had not even touched. But the computer had no problem finding it, and it that was game over. I mean, basically, once it did that, but this was a huge thing, right? So AlphaGo still was, you know, still had some human data. AlphaZero had zero human data, and it can still beat the world champ, right, just by playing itself, right? And so that was sort of like, okay, now all bets are off because this thing is showing in certain areas extremely smart behavior and other areas unbelievably stupid behavior. So Transformers is not like if you have kids or boys anyway, probably boys, maybe girls, but you know, this is a certain type of architecture of neural net that led to all sorts of stuff. I mean, and don't worry about how it did it, because self-attention, I tried to figure out how to explain it and read up on it, and it's just not worth it. But I think but the thing is ChatGPT, the natural language processing, being able to give a prompt and get an answer and all that sort of stuff, it enabled that. You're able to give a prompt and it'll give you an image. And then at this NeurIPS conference, you can actually give it a prompt and it'll make you a video. And I mean, it's insane. I mean, like the kind of things where you say, you could take the thing of saying mountain lion stables and all that and say, give me a clip, and it'll make you a video. And it won't get it right the first time, but it's still pretty crazy that it's able to do it. And basically, we'll get to how this led to the Nobel Prize work in chemistry, which is protein folding. So protein folding, how many of you are biologists? So you might explain this better than me, because I'm not. I'm an earth scientist. But so proteins' big deal is that their function is actually controlled by their 3D shape. And actually, the DNA base pairs and all this sort of stuff, that's sort of the code. But what's really happening is you're creating a complex 3D structure which is able to do something which is biologically very useful. And so it's been, for the longest time, for designing drugs, for designing, cures and all this sort of stuff, you want to know how to make something of a particular shape that has a particular function and so on. And the way you would do that with a physics approach is you would have to, solve all the equations to figure out how this thing's going to fold. And the AI approach is not that. The AI approach is just give it like a ton of data and see if it can figure it out. I mean, that is a lot of what you need to take away, is that people just give these things a ton of data and see what it figures out. And sometimes it figures out things that are amazing, and sometimes it completely screws up. But in this case, look at what happened. We're not talking about that long ago, because I measure everything by when my kid was born, right? It was like 2008, right? So 2018, they do this AlphaFold using the ideas of AlphaGo and all these other things, and it wins a global protein folding competition, just in 2 years, right? It's able to do, way better structure prediction, and by the time you get to 2022, AlphaFold predicts structures for nearly all known proteins, revolutionizing biomedicine and drugs. I mean, we're talking 4 years, right? Like how quickly it nailed this problem. And why is it able to nail it? Because there's just a crazy amount of data available for something like this. And clearly there are patterns that lead to what gives you the right shape. And so clearly this is the type of problem it's going to just do really well on. But it's pretty mind-boggling what it did here. And yeah, that's why it gets a Nobel Prize, right? So then, this is getting to be pretty recent, right? Because this is just like almost like last year. Is it last? No, 2025. So so this is the whole thing of where you're basically able to just say, give me an image on something, and it gives you the image. It can give you the videos are starting. You can even tell it to write music, And, the thing is people will look at this stuff, and you always hear when it messes up, right? And like, oh, God, I can't believe it made this error. Like you, right? But look up the computer in 5 years. It's just not going to make that error. But it'll make some other error. And so the thing is, it's just people like to pick on like what it was at one time, but this stuff moves so fast that it's just scary. Where if I would I'll just say that at my work, my number one skill that got me to fellow and all this stuff is not the intricate scientific stuff I do. It's actually being able to say, okay, Becky did this stuff, you did this stuff, you did this stuff. If we put these things together, this would be the innovation, this would be the impact, this is the knowledge gap. That's my strength. And like ChatGPT is such an equalizer for that, because you can basically have a terrible writer, that has really good ideas, which I think is actually a good thing, because because not everyone has to be the best writer. You made me a good writer, I guess, for my plagiarized essay. And so it's able to pull those things together in an extremely good way. And it's to the point now where we had to go through an exercise, because OpenAI gives us the models to evaluate, and we had to take every scientific discipline as part of this exercise. And I might have had a slide on this, but it's sort of like treat ChatGPT reasoning models like a PhD student, and give it an open problem in science and see how it's gonna go about it. And most people at LANL are really skeptical, right? They just think it's gonna suck, right? And most people came back saying it's like a mediocre graduate student. But that's awfully good, because if you did it 5 years ago, it was at the kindergarten level. Actually, 3 years ago, it's at the kindergarten level. And so that's where you just don't, we'll get into this a little later, but why is this Nobel Prize worthy, right? Because, Hinton is sort of a lot of these things on, the ChatGPT type stuff, being able to classify images. A lot of it came from his initial kind of breakthroughs. And then for chemistry, it all came down to the protein folding and so on. And it was so dominant a factor in science that even though these were mostly computer science achievements, which would usually just get the Turing Award, which it got, the Nobel Prize just felt like we would look like idiots if we don't give it to AI people because it's just completely dominating everything, and the breakthroughs have to be acknowledged. And so now we're going to go into a little bit more history mode of the world mode, not just AI, right? And so there have generally been two approaches that human beings approach to do like scientific endeavors. And so data-driven approach is just sort of, if you have an XY plot, you just plot up a bunch of points and you just draw a line through it and look for a trend. And so you sort of are just trying to look for patterns and trends. That's something that data-driven approaches are extremely good at. What they're really bad at, though, they're great at interpolation. They're horrible at extrapolation. Because, when you're interpolating between points, meaning it's within your data set, you can get it. But then extrapolation is basically you no longer have the data to support it and you're trying to predict something in the future. Data-driven approaches usually go off a cliff, and machine learning is a data-driven approach. And so LANL was very slow to want to use machine learning. Like, for example, the project that really allowed, make sure I'm not babbling forever. I think we're all right. And so, so the project that put my wife on the map at LANL was she really wanted to use breakthroughs in AI to enhance physics-based computation. And when we first showed that to red teams that tell you how's your proposal looking before you send it to the real committee, they were just like, do not put AI in here. It'll just get laughed out of the room. But we're like, no, like the rest of the world's having all these breakthroughs. We're going to do this. And, they ended up funding it. And that's how I and my wife ended up being like on the leading edge of AI. It's like the only time I've been on the leading edge of anything. Because usually it's like somebody bought some stock and I'll buy it by the time it's overpriced or something, right? It's easy to lag behind. And so data-driven approach, LANL doesn't like it because most of the stuff we have to do is predict into the future. Like, does the stockpile still, is it still going to work? What about this environmental stuff? What about this materials thing? It's not, we don't have the data. We have to figure out what's going to happen outside the data. And that's what physics-informed approaches are very good about, because you have an equation. So the equation, you just plug in the numbers and it sort of tells you what you think is going to happen. And there are physical laws that are constraining things. And so that's why physics informed. And so both have advantages and limitations. So throughout time, they have found the need to come together, split apart, come together. So this was a professor at Rice had this really interesting thing. Like, the Babylonians were some of the pioneers for data-driven approaches. And so they were actually really good about, but they would just sort of say, okay, it looks like, the full moon comes around this often. They just recorded all this stuff and they figured out all the trends. But then they would sort of go crazy because sometimes they would come up with the wrong trends. The problem with data-driven approach is you could sort of be like, I combed my hair today and I got a really good harvest, right, or something like that. And then you'd just be like, I think it's it, I'm going to just comb my hair, right, and that has nothing to do with one another. A data-driven approach could totally support something like that. And so that's where, when they had to predict stuff, they would often run into, major problems, right? And then the Greeks kind of pioneered, physics-informed approaches, even for the same astronomy stuff. But the problem with physics-informed approaches is that every equation is still just a simplification. You have all sorts of assumptions and stuff like that. And so you need parameters that go into your equation. Every equation only applies at a particular scale. And so you can actually do a great job on when the planets come around and all that sort of stuff with equations. But there's all sorts of stuff like protein folding where the physics-informed approach proved to be extremely difficult and the data-driven approach proved to be really good. And so, anyone with a brain would say you want to take advantage of both and try to minimize their weaknesses, which is what people are trying to do. But I think it's kind of neat that both of these civilizations kind of went a different way and they ran into limitations, and there's actually evidence of how they tried to fuse these techniques and all that, and AI is just the latest permutation of that. And so this book, I thought, is a pretty high-level overview. I mean, I read reviews on it where some people will challenge some of the hypotheses and stuff, but I thought it was actually fairly reasonable. And, basically this is this whole idea of information networks. And so how does he define information network? He defines it as what has led humans to be successful, to sort of take over the planet, because we're no longer limited to just our immediate family, and just, there are ways to get more people to work together than just your immediate family, which is actually, for the most part, not what nature does as much, right, at least directly. And it's a balance between control and power. That's basically how he defines it. And, truth. Sorry, control and truth. That's important. Control and truth. And so, the themes of this is just the whole AI and big data, which is some of the stuff I was telling you about. But then also, just how biology, culture, and these networks have basically shaped us. And then just how stories and myths are really how we work, much more so than facts, which would actually explain quite a bit. Like that. And so we'll get into that on the next slide. And then it's this whole, they amplify this influence and control. And whether you agree with the system, whether it's like Hitler and Stalin, which I think there's not going to be big fans, right? But as far as an information network, you could argue that it was an extremely successful information network on how it had such a good handle on control and such a terrible control on truth, right? But it still led to something that was, had quite an impact, in a negative way, I would say. But, and then basically it's this nexus, which is why it's called this, is just data, power, and, this. And so what was kind of interesting is these are sort of things that he listed as technological breakthroughs throughout human history. So like the first oral stories, right, when we figured out how to pass on stories, it's like a memory, right? And it's extremely important to have a memory because we don't live that long, and basically you need to pass that knowledge on. And it turns out if you try to pass that knowledge on through facts, it's just a snooze fest. I mean, like you just can't, like humans just don't remember it. Whereas, there would be all this stuff on like, God, like, why does my kid, like my dad, like, why is he always watching Star Wars, right? And then he finally saw, like, the Campbell's Power of Myth thing, and it's like, wait a second, this is just like the same myth that, that's been going over and over again, that's been modernized. We remember this stuff. I mean, Homer, Odyssey, I mean, all these things you can get. Most human beings get very interested, and they can retell it in incredible detail. We're really built for basically myths and stories and telling these stories. They really resonate. That's why, like, leaders that have a very good narrative are totally going to beat somebody who has facts. Facts don't really win the game, And so religious texts and myths, trade, knowledge exchange, printing press. And so what was kind of interesting about a lot of these things and the narrative that's out there is the printing press is often pointed to by the tech guys in Silicon Valley as what led to kind of enlightenment and science and all that sort of stuff, because all of a sudden everyone can get the books and basically figure out, okay, I guess we're not the center of the universe and, all this sort of stuff, and it's in the book. And but he pretty convincingly proves that, like, the main thing the printing press initially did was lead to, like, everyone buying books on how to find a witch in your village so you can kill them. I mean, that's basically what everybody bought. I mean, that's way more interesting. I mean, it's not great, but that is the thing that we tend to operate on fear. Fear works really well, and How to Find a Witch was the #1 seller. It was not Galileo and Newton and all that stuff. And then the other thing is that when you were going to the first books, but you didn't have the printing press, and the Bible was basically being hand copied, I didn't even know about this part. Like, if you would give it to a leader in a particular country, you would have that leader just say, like, hey, Becky, like, you're my Bible writer. Could you just throw in a few good words about me, like in the written copy, right? And then it's like, look, I'm in here. Right? And then the printing press completely screwed that up, because then everybody has the same book, right? But then it's sort of like who's going to include which stories, in the Bible and all that stuff, and all different religions. And then you can imagine radio, television, every single time. You can go back to the Nixon-Kennedy debate. I mean, Kennedy, it sounds like won because Nixon didn't shave, right? I mean, whether Kennedy had incredible ideas and all these sort of things, but why he won is probably not that, And so that's the thing. And then so every time you open up us to more information, disinformation completely spikes. And another thing that's extremely important, which I also didn't know, but you probably did. Like, I didn't know Stalin was a newspaper editor. He lists, like, all the people that have been, like, major rulers and power brokers throughout time that were often the newspaper editor. Because you get to control the story. And imagine, like, now what's controlling the story? I mean, AI and algorithms that are actually not even necessarily trying to do something evil. I mean, imagine if you actually aimed it to do evil, but it's actually doing something different, which we can get into. And this is how he's, talking about different ones over time, right? That Hitler and Stalin really maximized the order part, but then things started doing pretty badly when Stalin's planes are just falling out of the sky. They're not even flight worthy, or telling, plant the wheat, like in these conditions, it'll figure it out. And guess what? Like, the wheat just died, right? So eventually, the order sort of starts falling apart because the truth is just so obvious that even the average person just says, this is not right. Then science has the opposite thing. Science, for the most part, tries to prioritize getting to the truths to the scientific method. That's a generalization. You have plenty of bad actor scientists and stuff too. But, when Einstein overturns part of Newton's stuff, scientists are jumping up and down for joy, right? But most religions, if you overturn something, that would completely make the thing fall apart. Right? So those are just very different systems. They're both very effective information networks, though, on getting a bunch of people to work together to do something. And, whichever one you have, some of the things could turn out to be really good things or bad things. And, democracies in general seem to try to have more truth, but they definitely have problems with the order part because you just can't get everyone in line because everyone's disagreeing like crazy. And then, the whole authoritarian thing is also not that stable because when truth hits you in the face, everyone doesn't want to just die. So there's a whole thing about where does AI end up with this stuff, right? And so some of this, this is what I've been noticing, and some of it's in the book, some of it's not. But it's definitely true that the internet, I thought when everybody could just access information, it would really equal the playing field, right? But then it's just so much information that can become quite problematic because you can basically get into your own little media bubble, whatever you believe in. And then the issue with these algorithms is they just want you to keep using the platform. So, whatever I like, for example, on Facebook, for me, I never look at political stuff. But I love wildlife photography, so it just shows me, like, wildlife photography, like, all day long, hoping I'll buy some lens or something, right? And then I'm always wondering, like, how did you get such toxic stuff, like, on your stream? But, like, if you just Google one thing or something like that along those lines, you'll start getting flooded because the algorithm thinks you'll use the platform more, right? And so you can imagine that everybody, it's kind of human nature for most of us to kind of like hearing similar opinions, and it's more uncomfortable to hear the other opinion, and so this really divides it, right? And so that's been the thing. So this whole thing of manipulating the system, whether you're even doing it on purpose or not, is like a huge issue. And then, the whole tech companies collecting all this data, that definitely... that's the state that we're in. They've collected an enormous amount of data, and they're continuing to do so. But all is not good, like in the autocratic system either. Because, it's really good for surveilling everybody, right? Like Iran can check if somebody's not wearing their facial mask and, say, I'm going to take away your car and all this sort of stuff. You can be really, tight in the fist. But then, the other part of this is that autocratic systems may actually benefit because when things are so polarized because the algorithms are only showing you what you want to see, that you tend to go for the strong man because at least they sort of have some simple solutions and you just I don't know what to make of this news anymore because this is saying this is saying that. And so you just sort of gravitate to the more charismatic strong man type person. And then the other part of this that I thought was pretty interesting is that a lot of autocratic systems eventually do really badly with this because when you're a true autocrat, you are always worried about autocrat junior like overthrowing you. And so, if you're my deputies, I need to make sure you're all about equal so you don't kill me, right? And so you set up a state that that I'm basically playing you all off of each other. And basically AI is something that would be extremely tempting for an autocratic leader to just listen to, because then I wouldn't have to listen to any of you, because I'm always worried that your number one thing is to just get rid of me so you can be me. And so there's actually the AI taking over the autocrats is actually highlighted as a major problem in this book, like that, that it would totally be susceptible to doing that because they don't value the truth either. And so autocratic systems are favoring order, and they don't want to bring people into the loop, and all the information funnels into one thing. And then, let's make sure. Yeah, we're doing okay, I guess. I don't have much else. But I don't know how many of you are familiar with these ones, but the Facebook one was really tragic because, finally people in Myanmar could, get their news because everybody had cell phones. And so for a lot of these countries, you don't have cable TV and all that, but everybody had a phone, and Facebook gave them the news. But then the Facebook algorithm basically figured out that hate speech is, way more popular and gets you to look at the phone a lot more than the non-hate speech. And so, Buddhists, apparently, I guess every religion has people that are pretty extreme, so they found some really extreme Buddhist person, and that got amplified to the top. I think they weren't even famous at the beginning, and it resulted in, all sorts of genocide, and basically, even if you were the peaceful one and said, I want to hear about, the truth, they'll play you that video, but then on autoplay, you'll get the hateful thing right afterwards. And so that turned into a complete mess. And so a lot of those rules got put in, and now they've all been taken out again. And so you can imagine that's hugely problematic. These things are getting extremely good at creating images and things like that, and voices and scams. And so they could easily take my voice, call my parents, and say, I'm in trouble, wire me $1 million or something like that, and it'll be extremely effective, except that I live 10 minutes away, so, and they don't have $1 million. And then I guess it's what you train to. Everything is about what you train to is what you get. So if you train to a bunch of white people or just a bunch of men or whatever you train to, right, it's gonna be biased. I mean, it's just gonna basically totally misidentify minorities if they're not in the training data. If you just trained on minorities, then it's going to mess up the majority. But, it just depends on what you put into the training data is what you get out. And so that's highly problematic. And then basically, just those biases. And then this is the Tesla one we already get into. It's easy. It's an alien intelligence. It's not going to figure out stuff the way we do. And there's just so many edge cases when you drive. Edge case means something weird happens a lot more than you realize that we just take for granted, and we just handle it, and it won't. And then, so I think if, Amazon put in AI, because it's obviously fast and cheap, to hire, but it's looking for a certain type of candidate, and it just depends on what you put in your training data. And so it still comes back to us. It just means we screwed up the algorithm, but yeah. And then this mass surveillance thing, I don't know if y'all heard of China's social credit system. I mean, this is basically you've got a score the whole time, right? So I don't know, Terry's at the supermarket or something like that, and she needs help getting the cereal box off the top, and I do it. I go up in the credit system, which is maybe good in that case, but they're basically monitoring every single thing, and you sort of got a score. and that is something they've implemented, and more things are being monitored because we're always being monitored. And so bottom line, if this stuff doesn't get regulated, which I believe it's really not getting regulated very much, it is accelerating extremely quickly. And so, what does it mean for blue-collar jobs? This is, I think, the first time in history where some blue-collar things are actually pretty safe, because you probably don't want your food delivered by a robot or something like that, But there's still self-driving trucks, drones delivering things, and, the self-checkout at Smith's, which I hate. and then the white-collar jobs are definitely in danger because, the medical profession, for example, is not as much as like an R&D scientist, because you just can't guess. Like, yeah, I guess you might have cancer, and so let's try this really innovative solution. Oh man, it didn't work, right? So instead, it's kind of got to be like you're playing very safely. So there are ways doctors have to diagnose. They're almost handcuffed to make sure they don't do risky stuff. AI is great at that. So there's been all these recent papers coming out where like AI beats like the doctors and diagnoses and stuff like that. You could imagine lawyers. That's another thing where it can read so much text and it interprets text extremely well. I mean, for those of you that are not believing me, mess around with ChatGPT. It's mind-blowing what it can do. I mean, it is like nuts. I mean, it can take 10 pages of a very complex paper I wrote, and if I say summarize it in 2, it just nails it better than I can do it, even though I know it inside and out, and I consider myself a very good writer. So it's mind-blowing what the text stuff can do. The image stuff is catching up, but it's actually still got problems, And so, yeah, this was the whole thing of, that's what AI came up with for our kids project, right? Like Cougar going over the stables, it even has the shadows on the goats. It's got the trail cam, it's, it would be really hard to do that. Like, you'd have to, kids certainly can't do that. So just to give you an idea of how fast this stuff is going, right? Because it's almost like a human being, I guess, because 2000s to 2015, natural language models were at the kindergarten level, right? And then right now, it's definitely, you can scientifically say it's at the expert level. Right? I mean, how fast when you get like one model and it does something wrong, and then you get the newer one and all of a sudden it doesn't do it incorrectly anymore. It's kind of crazy. And then where is this going? This is where I still think the jury is out, though, because most things in life follow these trends, right? You're either, as you're a kid, and if I'm a tennis player, I start out kind of slow. I figure out some stuff, and then I really take off up to a point, and then I plateau, right? That's how most things in life go. And there are some things that you just kind of go at a linear way, and then there's a lot of this where we all plateau. And since most of us are older, we understand you plateau, right? And so I would always say, like, okay, Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic in tennis are so untouchable. And then there's this new kid. He's rising up the rankings. He's gone from 50 to 25 to 10, and he's just going to blow past those 3. He gets to them. He never passes them, right? He actually just gets stuck at number 5 and never gets there. That's the whole – there's a lot of things in life where you think you're going to get there and blow past something, and you just don't blow past something, because what if we actually – are pretty special and not that easy to blow past? The counter-argument to that is this thing can access the entire internet and digest it. We certainly cannot. So for certain type of problems, it's going to blow us out of the water. And so, at work, we use it to find, like, undocumented orphan wells that are polluting the environment and stuff, and so they don't know where they are because they were drilled around 1900. We use drones, multiple sensors, and AI can kind of pick out information like a needle out of a haystack that you could never do with the previous statistical methods that were there before. And so, you can combine all these multimodal data, run it through a transformer, and it finds the well. And, LANL's doing it in all sorts of areas, like, can you design materials? So Elon Musk, actually, I got to talk to him about 4 months ago. I mean, he came to LANL, and basically he wanted to know, give me a material that won't fracture at low temperatures for his space stuff. Because most metals become very fracture prone once you get to the temperatures of space. And can AI come up with a material design that overcomes that, for example? And, basically everything at LANL is being touched by AI right now. And then I think, a lot of people just say, oh, this is so scary. But the thing is, new technology comes around and the genie's out of the bottle. So it's time to figure out how to use it to the best of your ability and at least understand what it can do, because it's certainly not magic. It's just digesting a bunch of data and figuring out patterns like we do. It might be able to do it better in some cases. And for those of you that are like, I'm not going to touch AI, I doubt it, because even to unlock your phone, unless you've somehow turned off the facial ID, like GPS directions. I don't even know how to read a map anymore, right? I used to print out all these maps and everything, and it just tells you how to get everywhere. Definitely the targeted nature of ads because of your search history and all that, unless you go to the trouble of turning it all off, that's all AI, right? And so I think it's very important to know, what is it doing? Like, what is it, just to, at least it's giving me this answer, but what was it trained on? And, what are its limitations? What's it good at? What can I use it for to do something good? But also figure out, wait a second, it might not be very good at this other thing. I think it's very important to know, just like when you're driving your car, you know what it's capable of and all that sort of stuff, right? You need to know its advantages and limitations. And I think for the kids, they need to know where the heck is this tidal wave coming, because there are going to be jobs that are completely not needed. Like before, for me, I'm very good at programming. That's like my whole thing. Now, you could argue you almost don't need to know how to program. You could just say, write me a program that does this, and it'll just write it. So then you guys might be as good a programmer as me in the current environment if you're not programmers, because you could just write a text prompt and it'll come up with the program. So then you have to say, well, what can't it do? Well, like for me, it certainly doesn't know knowledge gaps that have occurred that are a combination of multiple different fields that would be a transformational breakthrough. We haven't seen it come up with something that's so clever where we're like, whoa, like we didn't think of that. It hasn't come up with anything close to that. But if it's just sort of writes something extremely well, like it's won some sci-fi award, like for some contest, right? Just mashing together various sci-fi books that also won awards. And so, but I think creativity and things like that, and just being able to know, okay, I don't need to know the syntax of code, but it's still useful to know how to run the code. It's useful to know, for the new workforce, they just need to know where this is all going so they can stay ahead of it, because there'll be plenty to do, but with every technology that comes on board, lots of things get phased out and lots of new things come in. But this one is particularly powerful, and so that's basically what I have. So hopefully it made sense.
You have a burning question?
You just touched on this. We haven't seen it yet. You mentioned data that influence creativity. Also, very good insight. Do you see AI as a role that how will we humans recognize?
Yeah, I think, that's a good point. Like all the latest models are supposed to have this reasoning power, right? And so they're trying to be a lot more about like how we actually learn. Like how would you teach your little kid to do, walk and crawl and all sorts of stuff? Because, for example, AI is extremely horrible with 3 dimensions. It doesn't really think about 3 dimensions. And so, if you do the generative video AI, and a ball goes around a corner or something like that, and let's say it's supposed to hit the wall and bounce back, it'll completely flub that. And another example of how it might think is there's people lying on beach chairs, and you write the prompt, I want you people to get up off of your beach chairs and walk away. And it did an amazing job, getting the people to walk away from the beach chairs, and then the beach chairs started walking, themselves, And then there's another one where they're showing all these nerves, like a carrot, right? You're cutting a carrot, but the carrot's actually getting longer, right? Because remember, it is not that's because that's the data-driven example, right? And a physics-informed example would say you split the carrot and it should get shorter. There's a conservation law at play. And then this insight-driven is trying to do kind of, it's another thing, right? Like, it's really hard to define what gets you that intuition to basically, like Einstein still did his thought experiments on the train, right? Like, I'm on this train, the other train's moving, they're at the same speed, it doesn't seem like we're moving. Like, his things are pretty brilliant, but once you explain it to someone, they'll just be like, I could have thought of that, but actually, no, you couldn't have thought of that. But like, once someone else explains it to you, you'll be like, wow, right? And so the real question you're asking, is that an emergent property, right? Because one of the theories is when you went from million parameter model to billion and trillion, that it has so many connections that that's where the real intelligence pops up, and that's why we have it too. Like, I mean, like, we just have a certain number of brain cells, and they all connect to one another, and at some point, you get above a certain critical mass and you show a certain level of intelligence. That's one belief. Another belief is we're a lot more complex than that, and consciousness and everything is not well understood. But it is true that there are certain things, once you get to billion parameters or more, that they sort of measure as emergent behavior, which is sort of getting towards what you're saying. So a lot of the work at LANL is actually in this topic called foundation model. So a foundation model is one that you don't have to have a training data set to figure out the answer, right? Like, and so here's an example of a foundational behavior of ChatGPT. So we train, like at the stables, you can only run like a million parameter model on a little Raspberry Pi, which is a tiny computer, and have it be fast enough to warn off the lion before it does its thing, right? But if you give it to ChatGPT on a really powerful computer, which is a trillion parameter model, it'll look at the image of any black and white animal, even if it's like really crappy, and it's mind-blowing. It'll be like, this is a mountain lion because of its powerful muscular structure. If you look at its size in comparison to the trees, it is about the right size of a mountain lion. If you look at the timestamp on the image, it's nocturnal. Mountain lions are often nocturnal. And then it'll be like, oh, this is a raccoon. It has a ringed tail. It has this type of stocky gait. It has this type of fur detail. Like, the explanations it gave were like mind-blowing. Like, oh my God. It's able to figure out all these animals with all sorts of logical explanations. And so for the million parameter model, the kids couldn't get it to work until they used the national park data, which had lions and non-lions, and you fine-tune the model to the national park data. And then it works. If you use ChatGPT, you don't even need the national park data because it's foundational. Like, it's basically able to figure out stuff because it's been trained on so many things. And I'd argue humans are foundational, right? Like we can, if I'm a tennis player and you give me a racquetball, I'm going to be pretty good at racquetball. Whereas actually these machines will completely fall off a cliff if you give it something that's not within their training set. But these foundational models are aiming to get emergent behavior that move towards intuition and insight. And it's not easy to measure it, which is why there's all sorts of arguments, because it almost becomes a religious argument at some point where people are like, this model is not, intelligent, and others will be like, well, based on these metrics it is, and I don't really have a strong opinion, right? It does what it does. So, yeah.
Well, this speaks to its limitations. Even for like lawyers looking at precedent. In 2023, a couple lawyers were sanctioned because they used ChatGPT and it made up precedents.
Yeah.
And they didn't double check the data.
Right.
And my other issue would be with the intellectual property when it's using all this data, whether it's art, music, writing, coding.
Yes.
Not giving credit to those.
So they're great questions. So the lawyer one. The other thing I forgot to mention, so I'm glad you asked this question, is that most times when a human being writes something down and there's all sorts of incorrect stuff in it, usually that goes along with being a terrible writer also. So you're just sort of like, I don't think this person knows what they're talking about. These things write extremely well, and they still sprinkle in, wrong things. And so for us to find the mistake in something AI generated is way harder than finding the mistake in something. Yeah, so that's a huge problem. And again, it's where's this curve going, right? Like, is it going to, like 5 years from now, is it just going to be like, you know what, it's like the best lawyer on the planet? Or is it going to be like, you know, it just sort of plateaued and it's still screwing up just as much as it did before? And I think the jury's out based on how fast this is moving. Intellectual property, I feel like they're just completely violating all sorts of intellectual property laws by training on all this stuff, and then they're so powerful because these companies are the richest on the planet, they can probably, this is just me guessing because I actually have no idea, because I've always wondered how this works. Because, for example, we were asked to develop an AI scientist and basically say, go solve this problem. So it's got to go look in the literature, but those journals, it's not supposed to have access to. And so for our kid, you'll appreciate this. It's like, okay, Becky's class is tough. Shakespeare, King Lear, you know, so I generate an AP English test, you know, so we actually use it to generate test questions and answers so he can practice, which is actually, I think, a good thing to do. But it somehow has, like, all the books. Like, so it totally, like, generates amazing tests. It generates all sorts of stuff that seems like it should be copyrighted. But they've got it. And they're super rich, so it's probably hard to stop them. That's the situation we're in. And I mean, even now, there's all sorts of stuff getting sucked up in what's going on right now. Yeah. You?
I was just wondering, would it be possible to create a AI fact checker?
I think they try. Yeah. Again, it's just, I think even one model versus the other one is, you know, they are always trying to fact check. And the other one of what you brought up, like, you can have it write extremely good text, but then if you tell it reference my text, it'll come up with, like, for example, I had my own 10-page thing, and then they tell you, we need a news article on this at a high level, like, tomorrow, right? And it's like, okay, first cut ChatGPT. It's my own material, just reduce it. And then, but then it threw in, like, a reference of one of my co-authors that seemed extremely like a paper he would have written, because it had his name and it had the title of the paper, and it seemed like, and then when I sent it to them, they're like, we're not able to find this reference. And I was like, okay, let me go to Google Scholar and try to find the reference. And it didn't exist. It took two different references and somehow mixed them together. But then some of you, what you should not take away from this is, well, then I'm not going to use it, because it literally could save, like, hundreds of hours, right? But then you had to go through it carefully because it's going to screw up, and you need to be extremely good at finding mistakes, though. You know, like when it writes code, it also is worse than writing text. Like, code seems like it should be easier because code is like a simplified version of one of our languages. And so I think it'll really get to code, but the internet's mostly text, so it's really good at text. So for English teachers, this will be pure hell. I mean, there is just, I don't know how you grade essays, because it writes better than almost, except the best of the best. It's really good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry.
So a few weeks ago, there was a lot in the news about this Chinese breakthrough and cheaper and older technology to make it more, maybe you don't have to be a super rich company or something. How do you think that's going to affect the whole AI industry?
Huge, because what they were able to do. So for those of you that aren't that used to computers, there's basically, you could have the executable, which is like, I've got Microsoft Word and I can run it, right? But I can't actually see the program that created Microsoft Word. And then there's open source code or your own code where you can look at what's under the hood, right? And so OpenAI's models, like ChatGPT, even though it's called OpenAI, it's very much closed, right? Like, they do not let you see their weights. They do not let you see what's under there and all the stuff that they trained it on. And so in theory, you can't just take their model and take advantage of it to create your own model. But they figured out how. Like, they were able to use techniques where you have sort of like the runtime version, And so ChatGPT would have been like billions and billions of dollars have gone into training, the algorithms that do this stuff. I mean, it's insane. I mean, even from a energy perspective, it's insane what it takes to train these things. But then the Chinese model, DeepSeek, basically was able to use what OpenAI has from the outside without getting under the hood and taking advantage of all its advantages and then training its own like $5 million model. And if everyone can do that, it's almost like no one wants to be the first one out of the gate anymore. And it becomes like the oil company deal. Like if you know how things like hydraulic fracturing and all these things, they're not going to be pioneered by Exxon and Chevron. They won't take the risk because they're the majors and they've all got Saudi Arabia and all the good land anyway. You have to be the mid company that has to take risks and try to do something innovative, right? No one wants to be the first to try the risk-averse thing anymore if you can just wait for, like, OpenAI came up with a cool model, I'll just use it and make my model that's way cheaper. And so the implications, as usual, there's a lot of opinions on this one, right? Because it totally torpedoes the need to spend billions of dollars training up all these different models. And I think the jury's out on, did they somehow cheat? Like some people think the Chinese actually ran it on way more powerful computers than they're claiming. And that they're just making it look like they did it on the cheap. But then there's others that say, no, they did do it on the cheap, and it's so recent. But it's a very important thing on where that falls because it has a huge, dropped like crazy based on that announcement, right? Because NVIDIA, which has all the GPUs that run these machines that are needed to train these things, right? Yeah, it's a pretty big deal which way that goes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about singularity and your thoughts on the implications of singularity.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing is, I've always grew up as a science fiction fan, right? And then I'm also used to life following those trends of, you plateau out or you take off or you go as a line. It's just I'm so used to things plateauing out. I'm just used to nothing just keeps, already the large language models and all that are showing a major plateauing in their performance. They're feeding it more and more data, and at this most recent NeurIPS, they were talking about we need new innovations or these things won't advance further. And so, but the thing is, there can be the next innovation that then takes it to the next level. But yeah, the implications are really a big deal, right? Because if AI can just, if you could just ask AI, I want a fusion reactor, for clean power, and it's able to draw upon, and it's not as crazy as it sounds, because it's able to draw upon all the literature in the entire world. It's maybe able to make connections that we're not able to make, and it's basically figured out what are the bottlenecks we weren't able to overcome, and all of a sudden you've got, because even this thing sat around from 1960 and not really doing much. What it's done in the last 5 years is insane. I mean, the protein folding thing in itself is really insane. And so, yeah, I think it's all new territory if you have a machine that's just going to beat the pants off of humans and a lot of stuff. And you could argue it does beat the pants off of humans and plenty of stuff. It's just not the stuff that, it's like chess and Go and things like that. But the Go one is actually a pretty big deal. Yeah.
So, we're all very curious. In the last week, we have heard so much about the effects on the laboratory of work on things like climate change, which I know you have been involved with, but it's you and the whole laboratory, and we don't know what's happening. So maybe you could enlighten us a bit.
I mean, so the energy secretary actually went to MIT, and he knows a ton about all the different energy systems, and he actually knew, when his opening address, way more about what the Department of Energy did than Rick Perry did, who was in the first permutation. And then he's actually, before this, he's coming here on Monday. And so I had to prepare slides for his visit. And then on top of that, these things are all fairly confusing because the jury's out, right? Because he literally only got into the position last week, and then there's sort of the cost-cutting measures, which are different than any individual office, right? And then on top of that, like they're sort of, Los Alamos is a contractor. We're not federal employees, so it's sort of like one step removed from people just getting like an email saying you no longer have a job and all that kind of stuff. And so we haven't had any of that at all. I mean, our director basically just said, we keep working on the stuff we've been funded to work on, and for us it comes down to the budget, right? And so historically the budget has just got to be agreed on between the Senate and the House. And that always turns out to be every senator and congressman cares about their own district. And so usually it's not, nobody really wants to give up their own thing. And so historically, things usually don't change a whole lot, right? But then until they do, right? and so, yeah, I think it's just too early to know what gets impacted which way in this administration. But so far, we've just sort of been doing our thing and just sort of watching the news as everybody else.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Harry.
Yeah. All right.